Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at the second live Facebook conversation hosted by the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School. My name is Robin Tholen. I'm a second-year law student here.
Hi, my name is Salome Gomez. I'm an ILM student here. We're very happy to host Dr. Ziba Mir Hosseini, a leading Islamic feminist scholar and an advocate for gender justice. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for the invitation.
So to start with a bit of context, Islamic feminism began in the 1990s as a movement for gender equality and a religious framework. And also in 2009, you founded Musawah, meaning equality in Arabic, which is a movement advocating for gender equality in the Muslim world. Can you take us back to that time? What was it like starting those movements?
In so many ways, I always say in my own writing that Islamic feminism is the unwanted child of political Islam. Because what happened in 1979, which was really the acme of political Islam, after the Iranian Revolution, we see a trend in Muslim countries towards what was called Islamization of laws and practices and policies. And before that, if we look at the beginning of the 20th century, we see a trend towards the secularization of laws and reforms, especially in the area of family law. So there was a reversal of that after 1979. And it didn't happen only in Iran, which had a popular revolution that created an Islamic republic, but also in Pakistan, with the hudud laws, with the criminal laws. In other places like Egypt, when Muslims political Islam were in opposition. But at the same time, in 1979, we have the CEDAW, the convention, the United Nations Convention for Equality, which is known as Women's Convention, and really brought women's rights at the very heart of human rights as well. It was there before, but CEDAW was a new mandate. So in 1980s, we see the clash of two frames of reference, two ways of looking at the law. And with the political Islam, the claim was that there is a return to Sharia. But in fact, it was a return to the pre-modern interpretations of the Sharia. And also using religion as a way for eroding the gains that Muslim women had since the beginning of the 20th century, when modern legal systems were created and codification of laws. So many, and remember that these things are happening towards the end of the 20th century. When women are already educated, they are already in the job market, and they can read. So many Muslim women go back to their Quran, and they don't find the patriarchal voice there. So they start asking questions and challenging that. And again in 1980s, we see the rise of NGOs, non-governmental organizations in Muslim context, and a transnational feminism. So all these things brought a clash between feminism, human rights, and Islamic framework or Islamic law. And by the early 1990s, we see a kind of resolution in the shape of a new discourse. A new discourse and gender discourse that locates its claim for justice and equality within an Islamic framework. And it has become known as Islamic feminism. And in fact, I was one of the early scholars who coined the term. And that was after the beginning of 1990s. I went back to Iran. I'm originally Iranian. And I saw a change. And there was a new magazine. And there were new consciousness and new discourse, which was both Islamic in the sense that the source of authority and legitimacy were Islam, but at the same time it was feminist in the sense of arguing for equality on all fronts. So we called it Islamic feminism. I called it Islamic feminism. And so I would say this is the beginning of it. But then Musawah has a different story, because also in the late 1980s, we see emergence of these new voices, both in Iran and elsewhere. And one of the earliest groups that called themselves Islamic and feminist at the same time were Sisters in Islam in Malaysia. Because in 1980s, you know, you either had to be Islamic or had to be feminist. There was no way to bring this together. And they started work in 1988, and there was a new discourse. So I was, at that time, doing research, and Islamic feminism was something that I was studying, both because of my own research. And I came to know Sisters in Islam, and basically that was the beginning of our work. And then we had 9/11, and the tragic event in New York, and rise of Al-Qaeda, a different kind of politics, but then the war on terror. And the war on terror, which many Muslims saw as the war on Islam, and rightly or wrongly, you know, this is not the question because the perceptions is here important, and the policies of the law, war on terror. So many of us found ourselves in a quandary. We felt that we were caught between the political Islam, the undemocratic side of political Islam that was imposing patriarchy in the name of religion and were depriving us from the rights and voice in the name of religion, and also the new expansionist neo-colonial project that was doing the same thing, denying us rights in the name of human rights, in the name of feminism. And let's not forget that the invasion of Iraq was for bringing democracy, for bringing human rights. The same in Afghanistan. And that really was a shock for many people. And it was then that at that time I was involved with Zaina Anwar and Sisters in Islam. And for the first time when I went to Malaysia, which was in 2000, I really felt at home. Because that tension between religious and secular feminism was not there. Women worked together, and this is not the case in the Middle Eastern context where I come from, and also not in Pakistani, Bangladeshi context that I am familiar. So that was really the beginning of Musawah. And we decided, you know, a group of us came together, and the reason that we came together was that we saw also at the international level that there is a rupture. Either people talk about human rights or either they talk about Islam. And it was important, especially engagement with the international community, like CEDAW community. Those who represented and talked for Islam were not really representing that egalitarian voice of Islam. And those that worked for the gender equality didn't want to touch religion and talked in a language of human rights that did not reach many. So that was the story and background behind it.
Great. So to talk a little bit more about Islam and feminism, a lot of people would say that these two ideas are fundamentally at odds with each other and they have no points in common. So how would you respond to that?
Yes, that was definitely the case. You know, that was the dominant discourse in 1980s and beginning of 1990s. My response is that, you know, before asking this question, we need to ask who's Islam and who's feminism, and who's human rights. And after that, we can really look at this, because there are different interpretation approaches of Islam. And of course, Islam of Taliban, Islam of ISIS is not compatible, and there is no doubt. But this is not the Islam of many people, including my Islam, including the Islam of Musawah. So there are other voices within Islam. There are other interpretations within Islam. And the same with human rights as well. You know, both Islam and human rights can be used for political purposes. And we have seen that, the use of both of them. So I would say that sort of criticism is there, but then before, you know, entering a meaningful conversation, we need really to unpack our own conceptions of Islam and our own conceptions of feminism. Yes, there are certain types of feminism, which is the white supremacist feminism. I definitely think it's not compatible. So we need to be a bit nuanced about issues like this.
So you mentioned the different interpretations of Islam, and your work as a scholar, you start from the same place as a traditional Islamic religious scholar in the text, but you come to a very different conclusion. How do you go about doing that work and interpreting that text?
Okay, to do that, first we need to understand how what we know as Islamic law now came into existence. And for that, we need really to think about what is Sharia. The term Sharia appears in the Quran only once, never in the sense of law. It is in the path, the direction that takes you to the source of water. And it is later, in the course of 2 centuries after the death of the Prophet, that we have this science of Islamic law, Islamic jurisprudence. And in the Muslim belief, Sharia is sacred. It is the law, it is the path, it's the way that is revealed to the Prophet through the Quran. So one source of this path, Sharia, is the Quran. Another is the practice of the Prophet that is collected in Sunnah, which literally means Sunnah. It's collected in the Hadith literature. And these two later were developed as the main sources of the law with other methodologies to become Islamic law. So from the very beginning, there was this distinction between Sharia and fiqh. Fiqh literally means understanding, and the science of Islamic jurisprudence. And this science of Islamic jurisprudence emerged in the course of 3 centuries. And by the time that, the fiqh schools emerged, women's voices were silent. Women are one of the main transmitters of the hadith, which is the second source of law after the Quran. And there were women who were actually scholars of hadith, and also women who were producers of law, in that sense, interpreters of law. But their voices were silenced by the time of jurisprudence came. And Islamic jurisprudence developed in the course of history after, Muslim societies from a small society, city-state in Medina was expanded into an empire. So it became also the law of empire. And the law was developed in that context. And the law became patriarchal. And one of the questions that we ask, and Muslim feminists are asking, and it's one of the tasks of Islamic feminism, is that how and why the law became patriarchal. Because when we go back, the further we go back from the time of revelation, the more we see that women are marginalized, and their critical faculties are denigrated, and a hadith tradition is developed in, and part of it really sees women as defective in reason, defective in faith, etc., etc. So these are the developments that happen. And what we need is to go back to the sources and understand it in the light of our own context. Because the Quran is not a book of law. Over 6,000 verses. Out of these 6,000 verses, maximum, there is dispute on that, 500 can be legal in a sense that we can derive laws from them, law-like. And a large majority of them have to do with the realm of ibadat, which is a category in Islamic jurisprudence. And in the area of the family and women's right, 140 verses. But many of them do not contain a legal order. And out of 6,000 verses, 6 can be interpreted as basis of inequality. The rest, the inequality between men and women is confirmed. You know, there is a chapter in the Quran, Surah Al-Nisa, which is the chapter on women. The first verse starts by establishing the equality. And then there is a chapter, there is a verse there which speaks of men having qawamun, having of being in charge of women, because it's a term of qawamun. And the question is that why that verse became the basis of the jurisprudence, not other verses. And these are because the laws reflect the culture, reflect the norms of the time. And the norm of the time was patriarchal. And those who read these verses, they read it in the context of their own realities and their own values. And what Islamic feminism is doing is first go back and understand, and then reclaim the ethical voice of the Quran, reclaim the ethical voice of the tradition, and try to understand it. So true that we start from the same basis, but we are not the same people. This is really the power of the sacred text. They speak to different generations. They speak to different epochs. And what is important is the essence of that. And the essence in Islam is guidance in the Quran and justice. And these are so important. And what justice means now in the 21st century is very different from what it meant even a century ago. And sometimes we forget the very idea of gender equality, or the idea of equality was not part of the justice. Look at the American Constitution. Women are not there. Look at the French Revolution. They are not there. But now it is different. So in our context and in our time, there can be no justice without equality. And women's equality is an important part of it. So we need to understand it. And it's so important that the Quran never defines justice. Speaks of justice in opposition to zulm, the oppression. So justice is one of those values, one of those concepts that we understand it when it is absent. Like, we know when it is day and night. When there is light, there is not. There are some things that you understand by absence, lack of it. And justice is one of those things. So justice in our time is different. And women in our time are different. So, and education is so important. It's not that women did not have education, but they could not pass their knowledge from one generation to another. And that happened also in the Western context. And in fact, the rise of feminism has come a lot to do. I believe that feminism or equality, the demand for equality existed from the very beginning. Because whenever there is injustice, there is another voice to counter that. But as a movement, as an intellectual, as something that could be passed from one generation to another, actually it happened much later. And what complicates this whole situation is in Muslim context, feminism, the feminism that existed and exists, is indigenous and native, really was entangled with the legacy of colonialism and policy of colonialism. So that complicates everything.
So building a bit on that, in order to move forward this incredible work that you're describing, you surely encounter a lot of difficult forces. So the rise of populism, Islamophobia, even secular feminism or extremist Islams. So how do you encounter these forces, and how do you move your work forward even with these forces?
Difficult question. I think, we started our work, and the very idea of Musawah started in 2007. And at the beginning, our idea was that, okay, we produce this manifesto, and we show everybody that Islam is just, and bring all this, and that would be the end of it. And then as gradually we started thinking about it, we thought that no, we are talking about a movement, something which is unfolding. And that also, it was very clear for us that it is important to be involved in the knowledge production. Because, as I said, women's voices were silenced. So they're concerned in the laws. Their interests were not reflected in the law. So it is important to do that. And at the same time, it is important, I think that you have the best interpretation of Islam, of the Quran. It's not going to change anything. Because it's important what makes one interpretation the dominant one. It is not because it is the authentic one. Because there is social and political forces behind it. So there is a movement behind it. And it's a change of heart and mind of people, and also the realities on the ground. So we knew that from the beginning that it's going to be challenged. And what we did, it took us 2 years to produce the scholarship. We invited the scholars, Muslim scholars, Islamic scholars, and also the activists to come together, and together to come up with a framework of action. And that framework of action was based on the papers that was commissioned, on jurisprudence, on theology, and that came out in a book. So when we had the framework of action, which actually took 2 years through the communication, meetings, and all this, and disagreements, a lot of disagreements within us, because our first aim was to bring women's constituencies together. And also, there is a lot of disagreement between women, among women's group in their approach. But we all wanted the same thing. But we choose different ways of reaching that way. And there was a moment that we came into a point that we decided to work together, and that was Musawah. And after the launch, we started our work. We faced opposition. And our main problem is, my main task is that the women whom we want to reach do not accept us as a source of authority. Okay? And we don't have those means of reaching them. We don't have radio, television, propaganda, or massive money that these conservatives put behind this conservative Islam, because there is an industry for it. And there is an oil money that goes on this one. And so we don't have anything. So we need to create a new voice, a new framework. And this is coming, and Musawah and Islamic feminism is part of the trend of Islamic law. So it is a minority voice, but we hope that it will become a majority voice. And the very fact that we still exist, exactly 10 years, from 2007 to now, means that, something is happening. We face opposition, we face political oppression, but at the same time, we exist, and we have allies as well. We have allies among enlightened clerics. Many men are also enlightened, and something is important is that gradually is becoming clear, is that actually equality is good for men as well as women. Equality is good for the family. And the stability of the family actually relies on justice and equality and partnership. So things are changing on the ground. So I can't answer your question how we deal with it, because we are actually a global movement. And by nature, we are everywhere. So our advocates, those who think like this and work with us, they develop their own strategies. But one of the strategies that I always find very useful is not to engage our opponents in private. Engage them in public. Let them come with their point of view and arguments, and we come with our point of view and arguments. Then the audience, women and men, can judge. And that exchange is good. But the fact is they don't want to do that in public. Right. Yes, in private, they actually, many of them who in public oppose us, in private they are okay. But, they are unsettled because some of us in Musawah do not wear hijab. And that is a signifier for some people. But many of us do wear hijab according to the context. And so it is, I think it is a political matter. So a part of it is a political act.
So a lot of movements like yours confront a lot of different critiques. Things like not wearing the hijab seems on one side of that, but are there any critiques of the movement that you think have any legitimacy, or how do you respond to some of the more, some of the discussions that you had within the movement where people had disagreements about how to go forward, things like that?
I think these agreements are just good, natural. And also there is a saying of the Prophet that is the mercy, the disagreements. Because it's through disagreements that you forge a new way of it. So we welcome disagreements among us, and there is a heated discussion among us. But at the end, we come to a kind of overlapping consensus, at the minimums. And I think it is important when we talk about Islam and human rights. These are the minimums that we need to agree. Because for human rights to be meaningful, it needs to go through the culture. It needs to have manifestation in society. Therefore, the same with feminism, the same with Musawah. And how, it's difficult, I personally don't see their critique legitimate. Because if it is legitimate, we incorporate it in and we correct our ways. But I see their critique coming from certain assumptions. For instance, one of the critiques that we face comes from the human rights community, comes from the feminists who are progressive, and many of them academics, and I don't want to name names here, that they say basically women like us are elites and are also playing in the hands of international community and human rights society, which is under the imperialist state and all this sort of thing, and we're imposing a kind of feminism or a kind of human rights. I personally find this problematic because the consequence of this, logical conclusion of this, is that because we are Muslims, because we want to argue for equality and justice, and because there is a hegemonic force, we should be silent. But the fact is that we don't look at that hegemonic force. It is there. We look and we listen to what is happening around us. And we react to that. And we don't set our agenda because, there is a global lobby. We set our agenda because of the needs of our own societies and our own needs. And the fact that human rights has become so much part of the consciousness of people. And it's such a challenging thing. And the fact that a human rights system or human rights politics is hegemonic is very different from the very idea of human rights. So, that kind of critique, I also find it insulting because it means that if you are a Muslim, you don't have human rights. And human rights is something which only comes from the West. And that is now how we see it. So that's one kind of critique. Another one is that coming from the religious side, that basically, we are ignorant. We don't have the knowledge. We don't follow the classical methodology. That one is also problematic because one of the aims of movements like Musawah is democratization of the production of knowledge. And that is very important because you cannot have a democratic society without having a democratic production of knowledge. And in Muslim context, religion knowledge matters a lot. It is a source of law and policy. Therefore, once it becomes a source of law and policy, everybody has the right to engage with you, especially women and who are the subject of certain laws. And that is also unfair because many of us, some of us are men, are scholars. I myself am not a scholar of Islamic law. I am an anthropologist. I am a legal anthropologist who has been working on Muslim family laws in different contexts for the past 37 years. So I approach the law and the whole thing from the ground, by the experience of people. And later on I became interested in the construction of the law, and now in the production of the new egalitarian knowledge. So we have different skills. Some of us, some of our scholars are theologians, they are scholars of hadith, and some of them are sociologists, some of them are anthropologists. So we are varied, and we bring different voices together, and we are interdisciplinary. Because if you are producing Islamic law or Islamic knowledge, it is produced in conversation with other branches of knowledge. And that was always been the case in the past. The Greek philosophical books were translated by Muslims into Arabic, and it entered the Western context through that translation. So the early Muslims had no qualm in that realm. And knowledge, I don't think that there is a boundary for it. And what is interesting is now women are producers of knowledge, including religious knowledge.
Wonderful.
Okay. Thanks so much. I think we're running out of time, but thank you so much for being with us here today. And thanks for everyone who tuned in to watch.
If you want to know more about the projects the Human Rights Program is doing, go on hrp.law.harvard.edu. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
Thank you. We still have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, always.
Thank you.